There's a woman in Providence, Rhode Island, who wears long sleeves in the middle of July, and in 14 months, nobody in that house has ever asked her why. To the people at the Ashgrove estate, she's just the housekeeper. 27 years old, too thin for the uniform, ash-brown hair cut short at the jaw, coffee on the counter at 5:55 every single morning, because the man who owns the place comes down at 6 and hasn't been late once. She doesn't stand in the center of rooms. She doesn't sit with her back to a door. She counts the people around her without meaning to, the way most folks breathe. The man who owns that house is 34, wears a dark suit with no tie and his father's watch with a crack running clean across the face that he's never bothered to fix. He runs the port, he runs the union, he runs things that never make it onto paper, and when he lowers his voice, grown men go quiet. The woman he's engaged to is 31, platinum blonde, red lipstick that never smudges, 3 generations of Newport banking behind her. In 14 months, she's never once used the housekeeper's name. She just snaps her fingers, calls her the help, the girl, that one. Then comes a Saturday night in October, 240 guests under a chandelier the size of a car, senators and bankers and every old family in New England holding a champagne glass. And that fiancée decides everyone should see what she thinks of the help. She crosses the ballroom, takes hold of the housekeeper's sleeve in front of all of them, and rips it up her arm. What she doesn't know is what that sleeve has been covering for 8 years. What she doesn't know is that the quiet woman standing in front of her spent 2 tours in Kandahar, training hundreds of soldiers how to survive. What follows is a blur of movement so swift, so precise, that it leaves the heiress on the cold marble floor completely unharmed, yet utterly defeated. But it isn't the sudden display of defense that freezes the 240 wealthy guests in absolute silence. It is what the housekeeper does next. Ignoring the stunned crowd, she slowly kneels in her uniform to retrieve a tiny, worthless piece of pink plastic that had slid across the stone, cradling it as if it were the last thing left on earth. A thin piece of pink plastic, worth about as much as a stick of gum. She dusted it off with her thumb, slow and careful. Nobody in that ballroom knew what it was. But by the end of the night, it would change how they looked at her forever, leaving not a single dry eye in the room. If a story about being overlooked and finally being seen means something to you, go ahead and hit that like button. Share it with somebody in your life who deserves to be seen today. And subscribe, because we've got more stories like this one coming. Now, let's go back to that ballroom and find out exactly who she really was. Morning at Ashgrove began in the smallest room in the house, where the ceiling sloped so low that Maeve Callahan had to bow her head every time she rose from bed. She woke at 4:40, without an alarm clock, because she had never needed one. The first thing she did was make the bed. She pulled the sheet tight, folded its edges beneath the mattress at an angle she had learned a very long time ago, in a place very far away, and smoothed her palm over the fabric until not a single wrinkle remained. A person could have dropped a coin onto it and watched it bounce. No one in this house had ever stepped inside that room. No one had ever inspected it. She still did it every morning for 14 months, because some habits weren't meant for anyone else to see. They were simply what remained of the person she had once been. Then she sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness and did the only thing in the entire long day that belonged to her alone. She rolled up her left sleeve. Around her wrist was a pink plastic bracelet, faded so badly it had turned almost white, thin as a ribbon and softened by time. She turned it around her wrist 3 times, slowly, without the slightest hurry, and on the final turn she stopped, pressing her thumb over the printed words that had faded until they could no longer be read. She didn't need to read them. She knew what they said. Then she pulled her sleeve back down, smoothed it flat, and fastened the button at her wrist. Locked. Done. And the woman who had been sitting in the darkness disappeared, while the person who walked down the stairs was the maid. She entered the kitchen at 5:15. She measured the coffee by hand, without using a scale, and it was always right. At 5:55, she placed the tray on the long table in the small dining room, and without giving it a second's thought, she turned it until its edge was perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. She stepped back half a pace, looked at it, and left. At exactly 6 o'clock, the man who owned the house came downstairs, and the coffee was still steaming. Not once in 14 months had he come down late, and not once had the coffee gone cold. It was the only agreement between them that neither had ever spoken aloud. That day, a new girl had arrived for a trial shift, and Wendell Barrow, the head butler, led her through the corridors. When they passed the place where Maeve was polishing the staircase banister, the new girl glanced back, and Maeve didn't look up. Wendell waited until they had passed through 2 doorways before speaking, his voice as calm as though he were explaining how to fold dinner napkins. He told her Miss Callahan didn't speak much, and not to ask questions. He said everyone in this house had a door they didn't open, and she kept hers locked more tightly than even the master of the house kept his. The new girl asked nothing more. Out in the garden, Ozzie Crone was trimming the hedges, doing the work he had done 6 days a week for more years than anyone could easily count at Ashgrove. On the 7th day, he wasn't there. On the 7th day, he sat on the advisory board of the Harbor District Community Center, in the seat reserved for veterans, and he hadn't missed a single meeting since the day they invited him. There was nothing worth mentioning about that. No one in the house thought it was worth mentioning. In the middle of the morning, Maeve carried a tray of cups down to the staff dining room and found Ozzie standing in the doorway. He didn't enter immediately. He remained there for the length of a heartbeat, and his eyes moved from left to right, touching every person in the room, one by one, before he finally stepped inside and pulled out a chair. He was counting. Maeve recognized it at once because she had done exactly the same thing 2 seconds before he had. Ozzie looked up and caught her catching him. They held each other's gaze for a single moment, no longer than that. Then he lowered his eyes to his coffee, and she carried the tray away to be washed, and neither of them said a word. For 14 months, neither of them had said a word. That was precisely why she had chosen this job. It paid in cash. No one asked questions, and no one made her tell them anything at all. One afternoon that month, Maeve was wiping the window frame in the first-floor hallway when the study door opened, and she heard the kind of thing the people who worked at Ashgrove had learned not to hear. A man stood in the middle of the room, his face drained of color, his arms hanging limply at his sides. People called him Rennie. He handled several shipments at the North Docks, and the night before, he had laid hands on his wife. Augustin Ferraro sat behind the desk and didn't rise. He didn't shout. He didn't even lift an eyebrow. He simply closed the ledger in front of him, looked up, and spoke in a voice so low that Maeve had to hold her breath in the hallway to hear him say that Rennie knew the rules of this house, that he had 4 hours, that the counting had begun the moment he walked through that door, and that he shouldn't make Mr. Ferraro count for him. No one touched Rennie. No one rose from a chair. He left the room like a man who had just been spared, and then he ran. By evening, his apartment was empty. Maeve finished wiping the window frame, folded the cloth into her bucket, and told no one. At Ashgrove, some things were entered into the books and some things weren't, and anyone who worked there long enough learned how to tell the difference without being taught. Mr. Ferraro was 34 years old, always wore dark suits, and never wore a tie, and around his wrist was his father's watch, with a crack running straight across the glass that he had never had repaired. That night, Maeve went down to the kitchen, close to 2 o'clock in the morning, to wipe the stone counters again, as she often did when she couldn't sleep, and found him already sitting there. The only light in the kitchen came from the small lamp above the stove, casting a circle of gold large enough for 2 people and not large enough for anyone else. He said nothing when she entered. She said nothing either. She took a cloth, wrung out the water, and began wiping, because in her mind this was his kitchen, and she was merely doing her work. He sat motionless for a long time, both hands wrapped around a glass that had gone cold, and at last he said that she wasn't afraid of him. She answered, "No, sir," without looking up. He told her everyone in this house was afraid, that they were all afraid, but she wasn't, and he asked her why. The cloth in her hand stopped for exactly 1 beat, only one, and then began moving again, and she said, "Because you have nothing of mine left to take, sir." The kitchen remained silent for so long that she could hear the refrigerator shudder and then fall still. He looked at her for a very long time, longer than anyone at Ashgrove had ever looked at her, and said that was the saddest sentence ever spoken in that kitchen. She wrung out the cloth, folded it into quarters, and placed it on the edge of the sink. "Yes, sir," she said. "Would you like more sugar?" He didn't answer. But the next night, he came down again, and the night after that. No one called it anything. No arrangements were made, and neither of them ever said aloud that it was happening. But nearly every night, the lamp above the stove was glowing at around 2 o'clock in the morning, And within that circle of light sat a man who couldn't sleep in his usual chair, while a woman wiped counters that were already clean. They spoke about the price of fish at the harbor, and how the fishing boats were returning later than they had in previous years. They spoke about the gray stray cat that lived behind the storage shed, the one Maeve left a small plate for, while he pretended not to know, until one night he asked directly what the cat ate, and she said mackerel, sir, and he nodded as though she had just reported a legitimate expense. They spoke about the weather, about how winter had come early that year, about how the western roof needed to be redone before November. Neither of them asked the other about the past, not once. He didn't ask where she had lived before coming there, and she didn't ask why a man who had everything sat in his own kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning with an empty glass. And that was exactly why it worked. But to understand why no one at Ashgrove had ever asked her a single question, one had to go back to that autumn afternoon, when the file was placed on Augustin Ferraro's desk, and only 2 people in the house had ever read it. Wendell Barrow had been responsible for hiring the staff at Ashgrove for more years than anyone could easily count, and Wendell Barrow was the man who conducted every background check. It was always him. He had never entrusted the task to anyone else. He spent 3 evenings in the small records room beside the kitchen, making every phone call and verifying every date, and when he finally closed the file, his hands were trembling. The next morning he carried it upstairs, placed it on the desk, and stepped back like a man who had just set down something far heavier than paper. He was the first person to read it. Mr. Ferraro was the second. There was no third. Inside that file was the name of a 27-year-old woman applying for a housekeeping position, and beneath that name was a life that not one line of her application had mentioned. Military police. 2 deployments to Kandahar. A certificate naming her a hand-to-hand combat instructor, the highest level a person in her position could attain, accompanied by the names of hundreds of soldiers who had trained under her. Then came the later section, the part Wendell had been forced to rise and leave the room twice before he could finish reading. A husband, also a soldier, lost several years earlier. She had been the one who found him. Then a daughter. Then the day that daughter was gone. And on the final page, written with the cold simplicity of an entry in an account book, was the medical debt that still remained under her name. A number that had stood there unchanged for years, because a thing like that couldn't be paid with the wages of a woman who cleaned houses. Mr. Ferraro read all of it. He didn't miss a single line. He didn't skim, and he didn't turn the pages quickly. He read it like a man who understood that this was the one thing the woman would never speak aloud herself, and because of that, he owed it his complete attention. Wendell stood on the other side of the desk the entire time, his hands folded behind his back, and he noticed the moment his employer stopped at the page bearing the child's year of birth. He remained there for a long time, longer than he had paused over all the other pages combined. Then Mr. Ferraro closed the file. He rose, opened the safe behind the painting, placed it inside, and shut the door. The lock made one short, dry sound in the silent room. Wendell asked whether he still intended to hire her. Mr. Ferraro said, "I do." Wendell asked whether he didn't want to question her about any of it. Mr. Ferraro didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window and stood there for a very long time, looking out at the garden where Ozzy was trimming the hedges, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than it was when he ordered men to disappear from the city. He said, "People have asked her enough already, Wendell." He said the entire world had forced her to explain herself enough, from hospitals to insurance companies, from the police to the banks, from acquaintances to strangers. Everyone had made her tell the story from the beginning, and each time she told it, she had to live through it one more time. Then he said, "Not in my house." Wendell nodded. He asked nothing more, and to this day he has never spoken of that file to another living soul. That afternoon, Maeve Callahan came for her interview, and the entire conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. No one asked her about the gap in her history. No one asked what she had been doing during those years. Mr. Ferraro asked only whether she knew how to make coffee. She said she did, and he told her she would begin on Monday. She walked out of that house with such overwhelming relief that she had to stop on the front steps to breathe, because for the first time in years, someone had looked at her without seeing a tragedy. She thought she had simply been lucky. She thought she had slipped through unnoticed. At Ashgrove, the maid believed she was invisible. She wasn't invisible at all. She was merely being permitted to hide by a very dangerous man, and that was the greatest gift he had ever given anyone. Cordelia Ashworth Blaine entered Ashgrove, not like a woman preparing to become part of the family, but like someone who had been sent there to take inventory. She walked through every room with a small notebook in her hand, and within a week the curtains in the sitting room had been replaced. The fragrance in the entrance hall had been changed, and even the water used in the flower vases had been changed. Because she said tap water made tulips die too soon. Wendell wrote everything down without comment. Marisol Ocampo in the kitchen did comment, but only to her cooking pot. Cordy never shouted at anyone. She had a method far more effective than shouting, which was to speak about people as though they weren't standing in the room. On Thursday afternoon, she spilled an entire bottle of perfume onto the Persian rug in the middle of the sitting room, and she didn't appear sorry in the slightest. She simply looked down at the stain spreading across the fibers, then snapped her fingers twice toward the door. Maeve brought in a bucket and brush, knelt down, and began to scrub. Cordy sat in an armchair a few steps away and called a friend, and during the conversation she mentioned the friend's dog by name 3 times, asked how it had been eating, and praised it for being adorable. Then she ended the call, looked down at the rug, and said to the empty air that the spot still smelled. Maeve kept scrubbing until her knees went numb and her hands turned red from the chemicals. The woman in the chair remembered the name of her friend's dog. She didn't remember the name of the person who had made her bed every morning for more than a year. That evening in the kitchen, Marisol pushed a glass of water toward Maeve and said, "Here, Maeve, drink this, child," then turned back to her pan. That was all. There was nothing remarkable about it. But Maeve paused for half a second before reaching for the glass, because it had been so long since she had heard her own name spoken by anyone in that house that, for one brief moment, she didn't realize they were calling her. She drank the entire glass and said nothing. Marisol didn't know what she had just done either. On Saturday, Cordy tried on dresses. The seamstress from Newport brought 3 boxes upstairs, and in the largest dressing room at Ashgrove stood a 3-sided mirror that reached nearly to the ceiling. Its base had been loose for a long time, so someone had to hold it steady. Cordy called Maeve inside. She stood on the platform, turned from side to side, studied herself, and said, "You don't mind, do you? I have to speak aloud in order to think, and you won't tell anyone anyway, because you have no one to tell." She said it in exactly the tone someone might use to observe that it was going to rain that day, without the slightest trace of malice. Then she began to talk. She said the wedding was a contract, that everyone knew it, that both families knew it, and only the guests did not. She said her father's fund was sinking faster than he was willing to admit, and the money from the Ferraro family was the only thing keeping it afloat. She said she would endure it for a few years, long enough for everything to stabilize, and then she would get divorced, and she had already planned for that as well. She said she didn't love Gus, had never loved him, and that he knew it too, and the best part was that he had never pretended otherwise. She turned to the left, studied the slit in the skirt, then looked at Maeve through the mirror and said, "You see, that's why I like you. You're like an empty room. A person can say anything inside you and no one will ever hear it." Then she turned her attention back to her dress. Maeve held the mirror for another 40 minutes. The seamstress pinned the fabric, removed the pins, then pinned it again. Cordy changed into 3 pairs of shoes. Throughout those 40 minutes, Maeve stood perfectly still, both hands gripping the mirror frame, while her knuckles showed white beneath her skin. Her hands didn't tremble once. When everything was finished and she carried the shoeboxes out, Cordy had already forgotten she was still in the room. That night, Maeve didn't go down to the kitchen. She went straight up to her attic room, sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness, and didn't take off her shoes. She rolled up her left sleeve, turned the faded plastic bracelet around her wrist, and allowed herself to remember, because on some nights, trying not to remember took more strength than remembering did. She remembered Narragansett Beach on a July afternoon, when the wind blew sand across their faces, and the sun had sunk low enough to turn the entire surface of the water gold. Junie sat on the beach towel with a strawberry ice cream bar in her hand, and she ate it the way only a child could, which meant there was ice cream on her chin, on her nose, and even in her hair. And when Maeve reached out to wipe it away, the little girl twisted aside and laughed until she couldn't breathe. laughed until she had to fall backward onto the towel, gasping for air, only to begin laughing all over again. That afternoon, Maeve didn't wipe the ice cream from her daughter's hair. She left it there until they got home. She remembered the stool in the kitchen of their old apartment, the one Junie dragged over beside the tables so she could stand tall enough to be level with her mother. Junie announced that she was going to help fold the towels. She folded every one of them wrong. No two looked alike. Some were folded into thirds, some were rolled into balls, and some were simply pressed flat and patted on top, as though she were patting them into good behavior. Junie placed that entire crooked stack of towels inside the cupboard, with the expression of someone who had just completed the greatest work of her life. Maeve didn't correct a single one. She left the uneven stack in the cupboard for an entire week, and every time she opened the door she saw it, and every time she saw it, she had to turn away because she was laughing. She remembered the book, only one book, the same one every night, and no other book was allowed, 41 nights in a row. By the 10th night, Maeve knew every word by heart, knew it so well that she could read it while thinking about something else. But she still had to open the book and turn each page at exactly the right moment, because Junie lay beside her mother, and the little girl's eyes weren't watching the words. They were watching her mother's hand, and if Maeve didn't turn the page, Junie would sit straight up and say, "Mommy, you missed a page." She remembered how much the little girl hated wearing socks. She hated them fiercely. Even during winter in Rhode Island, she would pull them off and hide them beneath the sofa, and once Maeve found 7 single socks under there, not one of them matching another, all of them pushed as far back as they would go like hidden treasure. Maeve had asked her why she hid her socks. Junie said it was because her feet liked to breathe. The little girl became ill. Then she was gone. And Maeve would never tell that story to anyone. Not because she couldn't bear it, but because she had learned that the moment people heard it, they forgot every other part. All they could see was the ending. They began speaking in that voice, the one that softened by half, and in their eyes Junie was no longer a child, but a sad story. Junie wasn't a sad story. Junie was a little girl who loved strawberry ice cream and hated wearing socks. That was what Maeve had decided to keep, and to keep it, she had to remain silent, and to remain silent, she had to clean houses for people who never asked her a single question. She pulled her sleeve down, fastened the button, and lay back without removing her shoes. Beyond the attic window, dawn was still a long way off. A very long time ago, she had promised herself that these hands would never hurt another person again. She had kept that promise for years, through house after house, through person after person, who snapped their fingers to summon her. She was about to discover that another promise still lived inside her, one far older than that. Cordelia Ashworth Blaine wasn't a forgetful woman. She had stood on that mirrored platform for 40 minutes and said everything that crossed her mind. And it wasn't until she was sitting in the car on the road back to Newport that she realized one very small thing that troubled her for the entire drive. That woman hadn't reacted. Not once. She hadn't flinched, glanced aside, swallowed, or shown in any way that she had just heard something capable of destroying a marriage before it had even begun. Ordinary people's faces moved when they heard things like that. Hers hadn't. And Cordy, who had grown up in a world where everyone was performing, and who had learned to read every role since childhood, suddenly felt the irritation of hearing a wrong note without being able to find where it came from. She called a private investigation company in Cranston, the kind that advertised on the back of the telephone directory and accepted cash. She didn't want to use her father's people. She didn't want anyone in the family to know she was asking questions. 3 days later, a sheet of paper arrived in her private mailbox, and there were exactly 3 lines written on it. 3 lines, nothing more. Dry, lifeless, typed slightly out of alignment, written by someone who had been paid not to care. The first line said that the woman had served in the military. That was all. It didn't say for how long, what she had done, or where she had served. The second line said there had been a routine investigation by the Providence police involving a death in a private residence several years earlier, and that the case had been closed. The third line said medical records sealed. Cordy read those 3 lines in the car beneath the overhead light, then read them a second time, and then a third. Nothing on that paper was fabricated. Not one word was untrue. Maeve's husband had died several years earlier, and she had been the one who found him, and she would never tell anyone more about it, and she had every right not to. The police had come, taken notes, asked a few questions, and closed the matter as they always did. Everyone's medical records were sealed. That was the law. Those 3 lines were true in every word. But Cordelia Ashworth Blaine didn't invent anything. She simply chose how to read them. And inside her mind, right there in the car beneath the overhead light, those 3 lifeless lines immediately rearranged themselves into something entirely different. There was something wrong with this woman. This woman had once been trained to do something no one was willing to put in writing. Someone had died inside her private residence, and the police had been called. There was a medical file no one was permitted to open. And this woman was living in my future husband's house, walking through the hallways at 2 o'clock in the morning, making his coffee, standing 3 steps away from him in a dark kitchen where no one could see them. Cordy read it a 4th time. Then she turned off the overhead light. She sat motionless in the darkness for a very long time. And the strange thing was that she didn't feel frightened at all. She felt relieved, because for months there had been something in that house that unsettled her. Something she couldn't name, something she couldn't buy, command, or understand, and now she had it. It fit neatly into 3 lines on a cheap sheet of paper. She folded the page in half, then into quarters, and slipped it into an inner compartment of her purse. She didn't yet know how she would use it. She didn't know when. But sitting in that car that night, Cordelia Ashworth Blaine knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would use it. The man called Rennie hadn't left. 4 hours passed, then a night, then a day, and he was still in the city. Someone saw him at a bar on Atwell's, where he spoke louder than usual and said Mr. Ferraro was growing old, that these days a man couldn't be driven out of the city over something that happened inside his own home, that he had been working at that harbor since before Augustine Ferraro even knew how to hold anything properly. 3 days later, he returned to Ash Grove. He arrived in the afternoon, stood at the gate, and didn't apologize. That was all anyone at Ash Grove ever knew about the matter, because he never entered the house, and 2 cars drove away from the gate while daylight still remained, and none of the servants watched them go. Marisol turned the kitchen radio up 1 level. Wendell went to inspect the wine cellar, a task he had performed only 2 days earlier. Maeve folded towels. No one said a word to anyone else, not because they were afraid, but because they had lived in that house long enough to know there were certain afternoons when it was best to keep busy. That night, the lamp above the stove came on close to 2 o'clock, as it always did. Maeve came downstairs, took a cloth, wrung out the water, and found him already sitting in his chair. He didn't look at her. Both his hands rested on the stone counter, and he held his back straight in the manner of a man who still hadn't permitted himself to feel tired. She poured the coffee, and when she placed the cup before him, she saw it. On the inner edge of the cuff of his white shirt, close to the button, there was a small dark stain. It wasn't large, no bigger than the tip of a little finger. It had already dried. Maeve saw it in less time than it took to draw a breath, and then she set the cup down, turned the handle toward his right hand as she always did, and went back to the sink. She didn't ask. She wiped the stone counter, the same counter that had been clean since 9 o'clock that evening. She moved the cloth in slow circles, and there was no sound in the kitchen except the soft scrape of fabric against stone. A very long time passed before he spoke, and his voice was low and flat, like the surface of still water. He said she wasn't asking. She said no, sir, without looking up. He asked why. Maeve stopped moving. She folded the cloth into quarters, placed it on the edge of the sink, then wiped both hands on her apron, slowly, 1 finger at a time. Then she said, her voice dropping into the same steady, practical tone she used when reporting the daily household repairs. I used to serve in the military police, sir, and I know which stains can be washed out with cold water and which ones can't. The kitchen fell silent, the faint hum of the appliances fading into the heavy, unbreathing stillness of the room. Augustine Ferraro didn't blink. He didn't turn his head, didn't look down at his cuff, and didn't ask another question. He simply reached out, lifted the coffee cup, took a sip, and placed it back inside the damp ring it had left on the stone. Then he said the coffee was good tonight, and he said nothing more. Maeve remained there for another moment, her hand still resting against her apron, and she understood that she had just unfastened 1 button on her own sleeve for the first time in 14 months, and the man sitting 3 steps away had seen everything and chosen to turn his face aside. She didn't know that he had read every line about her before she ever walked through the gates of that house. She didn't know that the thing she had just revealed, the thing she believed was a fatal mistake, had been locked inside the safe behind the painting for all those months, and that he had never opened it again. She knew only that he hadn't asked, and she was more grateful for that than she dared to be grateful for anything. Two people in a dark kitchen, each one keeping the other's secret, and neither of them ever saying aloud that they were keeping it. Theodora Ferraro had seen through all of them before anyone else did. Not through paperwork, because she never read the servants' records. She said reading paperwork about a human being was like reading a menu instead of eating the meal. She recognized it during the first month, in the small dining room, when she told Maeve to sit down and have a cup of tea with her, because she hated drinking tea alone. There were 4 chairs around that table. Maeve chose the only one with its back against the wall, and a clear view of the door. The old woman sat in her wheelchair, 88 years old, her hands already trembling, and she watched the young woman take her seat without saying a word throughout the entire cup of tea. But that evening, she summoned her grandson to her room. She said the girl who cleaned her room had served in the military. Augustin Ferraro stood beside the window, and he didn't look surprised. He said, "I already know, grandmother." The old woman studied him for a long time. Then she asked why he hadn't said anything to her. He remained silent for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Because you've never told anyone what you did that year either." He said everyone in this family had grown up, knowing only that she had gone away for a time when she was young, and not one person in the Ferraro bloodline had ever dared ask her another question, and she had never offered the story herself. He said she would tell it only when she wished to tell it. The girl was the same. The old woman sat motionless in her wheelchair. The only sound in the room was the grandfather clock in the entrance hall, echoing up from below. Then she said, "You're the only grandson I have who can do the things you do without blinking," she said, "and you've just said the kindest thing I've ever heard spoken in this house." Then she said, "I don't know whether I should be proud or afraid." He didn't answer that. He bent down, kissed her hair, and left, and she remained there alone for a very long time. Not long afterward, she summoned Maeve to her room. It was afternoon. The windows were open, and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted in from the garden. Maeve stood in the middle of the room, with her hands folded over her apron, waiting to be given an order. The old woman gave her none. She merely looked at her for a moment and said, "You sit with your back against the wall." Maeve didn't move. The old woman said, "Battlefield nurses do the same thing, child. All of us do, and that habit never leaves. It follows a person all the way to the grave." She said, "I'm not going to ask you anything. I won't ask where you were. I won't ask what you did. I won't ask why you wear long sleeves in the middle of summer, and I won't tell anyone either." Then she said, "I only want you to know that there is at least one person in this house who knows you aren't an empty room." Maeve stood perfectly still. Far out in the garden came the faint clipping sound of pruning shears. The old woman lowered her eyes to the trembling hands resting in her lap, then said, as softly as though she were speaking about the weather, "I have something I've never told anyone either, Miss Callahan." She said, "It has been 70 years, she said. People always imagine that when you grow old, you run out of things to hide." Then she reached for her teacup and said nothing more. And the sentence drifted through the room like a leaf falling beyond the window, and no one reached down to pick it up, not even Maeve. Maeve remained motionless for a very long time, longer than she had stood holding the mirror for Cordelia. Then she said, "Thank you." She spoke those 2 words very softly, turned away, and left the room faster than she usually did, so quickly that the old woman didn't have time to see her eyes. Theodora listened to Maeve's footsteps descend the entire staircase before setting down her teacup. And so there were 2 people at Ashgrove who knew the truth about Maeve Callahan, and both of them knew because they respected her, and both chose silence for the very same reason. And in Newport, tucked inside the inner compartment of a purse, there was a sheet of paper folded into quarters with exactly 3 lines written upon it. In the final week of October, Ashgrove's great hall was opened. The chandelier was lowered by the pulley system hidden in the ceiling, a mechanism used only a few times in a lifetime, and Maeve and 2 housemaids cleaned every crystal branch, one by one, for 2 entire days. The marble floor was polished until it reflected the ceiling above. 240 chairs were brought in. On the afternoon before the event, Cordelia stopped Maeve in the corridor leading to the great hall while she was carrying a box of napkins. Cordy didn't raise her voice. She simply stood in Maeve's path and said that tomorrow evening she would remain in the corner of the room, that she wouldn't walk around, that she wouldn't look at anyone, and that she understood her place, didn't she? And Maeve, for the first time in 14 months, lifted her head and looked directly into her eyes. She said, "Miss, I have never forgotten my place. You have simply never bothered to ask where it is." Cordy froze for exactly half a second. In all her life, no one standing on the other side had ever answered her back, and that half-second lasted longer than she expected. Then she said, "Tomorrow night you'll understand," and walked away. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the lamp above the stove glowed for the final time before the storm. He was sitting in his usual chair, and this time he said nothing about the price of fish or the stray cat behind the storage shed. Maeve poured his coffee, then stood there, and then she asked him a question she had never asked in 14 months. She asked, "Do you love her, sir?" He turned the cup in his hand for a long time, making exactly 3 circles against the stone, and then he didn't answer her question. Instead, he asked whether she knew why he came down there every night. She said, "Because you can't sleep." He said, "Because this is the only room in the house where no one is pretending." Maeve nodded. She lifted the coffee pot and poured him another cup, and she didn't ask anything more. They had both already answered. On Saturday evening, the great hall shone like something that wasn't real. Crystals scattered light across the ceiling. A string quartet played in the far corner. Champagne moved through the room on silver trays, and among the guests were senators, bankers, and families who had lived in New England since before America existed. Maeve stood exactly where she had been ordered to stand, in the corner of the room, with both hands resting in front of her apron. And while she stood there, she did what she always did without intending to. She counted the exits: 3 large shutgicks, 2 service doors, and 1 French door opening onto the terrace. She counted the people. She even calculated the distance from where she stood to every exit and footsteps, and she had no idea she had done it. Close to 9 o'clock, the music softened, and Augustin Ferraro raised his glass. He didn't speak for long. He thanked everyone for coming, mentioned his grandmother, sitting in the front row in her wheelchair, and the entire room laughed quietly when he said she had threatened to leave early if he spoke for more than 3 minutes. And in the middle of a sentence, his eyes swept across the room, passing over the faces, and stopped for half a second at the corner where the maid stood with her hands resting before her apron. Half a second. Then he continued speaking, and no one noticed. Not one of the 240 people in that room saw it. Cordelia Ashworth Blaine did. She stood beside him, one hand resting on his arm, her champagne glass held level with her chest, and she saw every instant of that half-second. And in that half-second, a 31-year-old woman who knew perfectly well that she was nothing more than a contract with a dress code, a woman who had sat in a car reading 3 lines beneath an overhead light, suddenly understood that the one thing she couldn't buy with 3 generations of banking wealth was being given away freely, without cost, to a woman who knelt on the floor to scrub rugs. She placed her glass on a passing tray. She stepped onto the dance floor. The music was still playing. Cordelia walked straight toward the corner where the quartet was playing, and reached for the small microphone resting on its stand. The violinist stopped in the middle of a note, then the cello fell silent. Then the entire room stopped, in the way a crowded room always stops, from the outside inward, layer by layer, until all 240 faces had turned in the same direction. Cordy smiled. She said, "Excuse me, everyone. Just 1 minute." She said, "I'd like to introduce someone." Then she said, "Our servant," and crossed the marble floor, her heels striking at an even rhythm through the silence, walking directly toward the corner where Maeve still stood with both hands resting in front of her apron. She didn't say another word. She reached out, seized the left sleeve at Maeve's wrist, and ripped it upward all the way to her shoulder. Light from the chandelier poured straight down. The entire room saw the scar, long and old, running from her elbow upward before disappearing beneath the fabric. The entire room saw the faded pink plastic bracelet wrapped around that wrist, nearly white now, limp and fragile and utterly out of place on an arm like hers. Cordy raised the microphone and said, "Here, everyone, look." She said 3 missing years in her records, no family, no one to vouch for her. She said, "This is what has been walking through our house at 2 o'clock in the morning." Not one person in the room moved. In the front row, Theodore Ferraro placed one hand on the rim of her wheelchair and stopped there. Maeve didn't pull her arm away. She could have. She could have done it so quickly that no one in the room would have understood what had happened, and Cordelia would simply have found her hand suddenly empty. But she didn't pull away. She stood still, allowing her arm to be held up beneath the lights for 240 people to stare at, and she said, very softly enough that Cordelia alone could hear her, "Let go of me." Then she said, "Please." Those two words fell between the two women, and no one else in the room heard them. Once, in a place very far away, Maeve Callahan had been taught that when she spoke, 200 soldiers would obey, and she had never been required to say please to anyone. She had said it now. Cordelia didn't let go. Rather, she did release her, but only so she could draw back, and then she shoved her. She drove both hands into Maeve's shoulders, the kind of shove people used when they wanted to send someone stumbling backward a few steps and humiliate them properly. Maeve didn't move. It wasn't that she braced herself. She simply didn't go anywhere. Her center of gravity dropped by half a hand's breadth. Her rear leg absorbed the entire force, and her body took the shove the way a wall takes the wind. A very soft murmur moved through the room, faint but spreading. 240 people had just witnessed something they didn't understand, though their bodies understood it perfectly. Cordelia saw it too, and because she saw it, she raised her hand. Maeve closed her eyes. She closed her eyes and stood still, both arms hanging loosely at her sides, because a very long time ago she had promised herself that these hands would never hurt another person again, and she had kept that promise through house after house, through countless snapping fingers, through all those years, and she intended to keep it one more time. She was going to let it happen. But Cordelia's other hand didn't move toward her face. It dropped toward her wrist, her fingers hooked beneath the fragile plastic bracelet, tore it free, and flung it into the middle of the floor. The bracelet sailed beneath the chandelier, turning once in the light, and struck the marble. The sound was very small, smaller than a spoon falling, smaller than a button dropping, but in that utterly silent room, it echoed against all four walls, rose all the way to the ceiling, and didn't sound like plastic touching stone at all. It sounded like something had just broken open, and Maeve Callahan's body moved before her mind could stop it. There was no punch, there was no kick, there was only a basic throw, the first thing they taught and the last thing anyone forgot. The same movement she had once stood on a training floor and taught again and again to 200 soldiers, until they could perform it in their sleep. Catch the descending wrist. Turn the hips. Add no force, not even the slightest amount. Only borrow the momentum Cordelia herself had created and guide it onward in the direction it already wanted to go. The entire room watched the high heels leave the floor. And at the final second, when everything had already been decided and there was nothing left to undo, and all 240 people in the room knew what was about to strike the stone, Maeve's left palm slipped underneath Cordelia's head, caught it, and lowered her onto the marble as gently as though she were placing a sleeping child into bed. Maeve rose to her feet. She didn't look down at the woman lying on the floor, not once, not even for half a second. She straightened and turned her head toward the place where that small sound had come from, then took 3 steps. And then she knelt on the marble floor in the middle of Ashgrove's great hall, dressed in her pink and white uniform, before 240 people, and picked up the piece of plastic between 2 fingers as though she were lifting a dead butterfly. She brought it close to her eyes. She turned it over. Then she brushed the dust from it with her thumb, once, then once again, slowly and carefully, following the line of words that had faded until no one could read them anymore. And she continued brushing it for longer than everything that had happened before it combined. 240 of the wealthiest people in Rhode Island stood watching her. Senators, bankers, families who had lived there since before America existed. All of them were watching a woman kneel on the floor and brush dust from a piece of plastic worth about as much as a stick of chewing gum, and not one of them understood what they were seeing. Behind her, Cordelia struggled to her feet. She planted her hands on the floor, managed to stand, and her hair had fallen loose on one side while her mascara ran in 2 black streaks beneath her eyes, and she wasn't injured anywhere. She screamed that it attacked me. She screamed, "You all saw it. Call the police. Call them now." Not one person in the room moved. Maeve stood upright, the piece of plastic resting inside her loosely closed palm. And then, for the first time in 14 months inside that house, she raised her head and looked directly into the eyes of another human being in that room. She said, "My name is Maeve Callahan." Her voice wasn't loud. It simply carried all the way to the farthest wall, the way a voice that had once been required to cross a training ground through wind and sand still carried. She said, "Former Sergeant, Army Military Police. 2 deployments to Kandahar." She said, "I was trained to do things I swore I would never do again." Then she reached across with her right hand and rolled up the torn left sleeve herself, allowing no one else to pull it back, and held her scarred wrist beneath the light of the chandelier. She said, "This came from a night in August." She said, "My convoy." She said, "I pulled 3 people out. I couldn't reach the 4th. She said she was 19 years old, and I had promised her mother I would bring her home." There wasn't a sound in the great hall. Not one glass touched another. Then she said, "Since that night, I have believed one thing, and I have believed it for 8 years. She said, "I don't save anyone." She let those words rest in the middle of the room for a while. 240 people stood there, and none of them knew what to do with them. Then Maeve lowered her arm, extended her left hand before her, and opened her palm. The faded pink piece of plastic lay there, tiny, limp, and pale, something anyone in that room would have swept into the trash without looking twice. She said, "And this?" She said, "The thing you just threw onto the floor." She said, "This is my daughter's hospital bracelet." Not one person in the room moved. In the front row, Theodora Ferraro's trembling hand tightened around the rim of her wheelchair. In the corner, Marisol Ocampo raised both hands to cover her mouth. Wendell Barros stood beside the service door without moving, his face drained white. Augustin Ferraro stood in the middle of the floor with yet his champagne glass, still in his hand, and he didn't move, because he was the only person in that room who had known what her next words would be for many months, and he had never imagined he would have to hear them spoken aloud. And somewhere among the back rows, surrounded by some of the oldest families in New England, someone began to cry. Maeve closed her palm around the piece of plastic. She said, "My daughter became ill," she said. "I won't tell that story here." And her voice remained entirely detached, carrying the quiet precision of a soldier reporting facts on a cold morning. She said, "Because she wasn't a sad story." She said, "She was a little girl who loved strawberry ice cream and hated wearing socks." She said she hid her socks beneath the sofa in the middle of a Rhode Island winter and told me it was because her feet liked to breathe. She said, "She made me read the same book every night, the same one, for 41 nights in a row. And I had known every word by heart for a long time, but I still had to open the book because she watched my hand instead of the words, and if I didn't turn the page, she would sit straight up." Then she stopped. The entire room waited. Not one of those 240 people moved. And perhaps it was the first time in many of their lives that they had stood still and waited for something they couldn't buy. Then Maeve said, "I will tell you only one thing," she said. "During the final 15 minutes I had with my child, I was sitting beneath the parking garage." She said, "I was arguing on the telephone with someone in California about money, someone I had never met and would never meet. And I had called them 9 times before, and they only work during West Coast business hours." She said, "By the time I reached her, it was too late." She said, "I traded the last 15 minutes of my daughter's life for a phone call I still lost." There wasn't a sound in the great hall. She said, "I will carry that with me for the rest of my life." She said, "I'm not asking anyone for pity, and I don't want anyone here to pity me." She said, "I'm only explaining why I clean houses, because it pays in cash, because no one asks questions, because no one makes me tell the story." Then she turned her head and looked at Cordelia Ashworth Blaine, who was still standing there with her hair fallen loose on one side and 2 black streaks beneath her eyes. She said, "You could call me a servant for 14 months. I could endure that," she said. "You could make me kneel and scrub carpets until both my legs went numb. I could endure that." Then she said, "But you don't get to throw my daughter onto the floor." There came the sound of a glass being set down. Augustin Ferraro placed his champagne glass on the nearest table, crossed the dance floor, and walked past his fiancée as though he were passing an empty chair. He stopped in front of Maeve. He didn't look at the scar. He didn't look at the torn sleeve. He looked into her eyes and asked why she had never told him. Maeve remained silent for a moment. Then she said, "Because the moment people learn what you're capable of, they stop seeing who you are," she said. They would look at me and see a thing instead of a person. She said, I wanted to be allowed to be a person first. Then her voice softened, and she said, Here, you were the only one who never asked me a single question. Agustin Ferraro stood motionless for a very long time. Then he said, I knew. Those two words fell between them, and in the entire room only 3 people understood what they meant, and one of those 3 was standing beside the service door, with a face drained white. Then he reached across with his right hand, and pulled up his left sleeve. His father's watch rested there, and beneath the chandelier everyone could see the crack running straight across the glass. The crack people in Providence had speculated about for years, and no one had ever dared ask him about. He said, Do you know why this glass is cracked? He said, It cracked one night when I was 24 years old. He offered nothing more. He didn't say where it happened, who had been there, or what had occurred. He said, I have never told anyone that story. Then he said, I leave it broken because I don't want to forget that there was a version of me who stopped right there. He looked at her. He said, For 14 months I have come down to the kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning without understanding why. He said, I thought it was because I couldn't sleep. Then he said, Now I understand. He said, You are the only person in this house who also wears something broken and refuses to have it repaired. He didn't reach for her. He didn't touch her. He simply stood there with his sleeve pulled back, while she stood before him with her sleeve torn, and between them lay a faded pink piece of plastic inside her loosely closed palm. A man and a woman in a room filled with crystal, each carrying something broken beneath their clothing, both of them refusing to allow it to heal. And for 14 months they had sat together in the darkness without ever understanding why it had been so much easier to breathe beside each other. Then came the sound of wheelchair wheels rolling across the marble floor. Theodora Ferraro pushed herself into the center of the great hall, refusing to let anyone touch the handles, and 240 people automatically parted before her like water dividing around the bow of a ship. She stopped in the middle of the room. She said, I am 88 years old. Her voice was thin, but there wasn't another sound in that room to compete with it. She said, Once I was 22, and I stitched 19-year-old children back together by flashlight, because turning on a real light would have gotten all of us killed. She let those words remain there for a moment. Then she slowly turned her wheelchair and looked out across the standing crowd, from the first row to the very last, studying every face one by one. She said, I have spent the past 2 hours watching this room. She said, You have stood here drinking my family's wine, and not one of you asked the name of the person who poured it. No one answered. Several people lowered their eyes to the floor. Then she turned her chair toward Cordelia. She said, Young woman. She said, You weren't attacked. You were spared, she said. There is a difference, and perhaps if you live another 60 years, you will understand why you are still unharmed tonight. Cordelia opened her mouth, then closed it again. Then the old woman turned her chair one final time, toward the woman standing in the middle of the floor with a torn sleeve and a piece of plastic resting in her palm, and her voice broke. Only once, only on the first 2 words, but the entire room heard it. She said, And you. Then she said, Sergeant, she said, I have waited 14 months to call you by your rank. Near the service door came the sound of shoes. Ozzie Crone stepped away from the line of servants standing close against the wall, walked 3 steps onto the floor, and came to attention. He said nothing. Then Marisol Ocampo stepped forward, the kitchen cloth still wrapped around one hand, and stood beside him. Then Wendell Barrow. Then the 2 housemaids, both of them crying and neither wiping her face. They formed a line behind Maeve, and they weren't standing there to protect her, because the entire room had just seen clearly that she didn't need anyone's protection. They stood there so they could be seen beside her. And the crowd turned its back on Cordelia Ashworth Blaine. Not because of Maeve, but because throughout that entire evening, and throughout all the years that had come before it, they had seen themselves reflected in Cordelia, and they hated that more than anything. Cordy turned toward Agustin Ferraro and said, Mr. Ferraro, my father will. He didn't allow her to finish. He said, Your father needs money. He said, I won't give him a single cent. Her face went pale. He said, Not because of tonight. He said, Because I know where that money is flowing and who is flowing with it. He said, If I give it to him, I put my name on it, and you will sink with him. The room remained silent. Then he said, But my attorney will call you. Tomorrow morning. He said, Not for your father. For you. He said, "Withdraw from the fund before Friday and you will be a witness instead of a defendant." Cordelia stood as though she had been nailed to the stone floor. A long time passed before she managed to ask, and her voice no longer sounded like the voice of the woman who had held the microphone. She asked, "Why would you do that for me?" He said, "Because you are 31 years old, and people have sold you twice in a single year." Then he said, "I don't buy people, Cordelia." "I thought you didn't either." She didn't answer. She bent down, picked up her purse, and walked out of the great hall alone, and no one followed her. The sound of her heels struck the marble for the entire length of the room, then for the entire length of the corridor, growing farther away with every step, steady as a countdown clock that had finally run out. Then the great doors closed, and all that remained in Ashgrove's great hall was the breathing of 240 people, who had just been taught something none of them had ever paid to learn. The following week, the Harbor District Community Center called her. Not because of the newspaper article, because there hadn't been one yet. It was because Marisol had a nephew who studied there. Because Marisol had told them. Maeve went, and she stood alone inside an empty training room with scratched wooden floors, and when they asked what she wanted to name it, she spoke aloud the name she hadn't said in 3 years. At 7 o'clock the next morning, less than 12 hours after the great doors had closed behind Cordelia, the doorbell rang at Ashgrove. Wendell Barrow answered it, because that was his duty, and on the front steps stood 2 men in gray coats, exactly 1 pace apart in the manner people learned in only one kind of place. They didn't arrest anyone. They didn't raise their voices. They simply asked whether Mr. Ferraro was at home, and when he came to the door, one of them handed him a sheet of paper folded into thirds, as politely as though he were presenting an invitation. The man said, "Congratulations on your engagement, Mr. Ferraro." Then he said, "Though I hear it has been called off." Augustine Ferraro said nothing. He took the paper, unfolded it, and read, and his face didn't move. The other agent studied the garden for a moment as though considering whether to purchase it, then said, "We had planned to wait until after the wedding." He said, "Once 2 families merge, the records become 10 times more complicated, the accounts overlap, the funds overlap, and we would have had to peel everything apart, 1 layer at a time." Then he said, "You have just saved us 6 months." And he gave a very courteous nod before the 2 men turned and walked back toward their car. Wendell closed the door and remained there with one hand still resting on the knob. That engagement had been a shield. It had never been anything else. As long as the 2 names were preparing to merge, no one wanted to move against both families, and that was precisely why they had been waiting. The night before, in his own great hall, Augustin Ferraro had broken that shield with his own hands to save a woman he didn't love from sinking with her father. His kindness, in the most literal sense of the word, was what had summoned them to his door. In Newport, Sterling Ashworth Blaine received a call from his daughter's attorney on Tuesday morning, and by Friday afternoon Cordelia had withdrawn. He sat in his study and understood perfectly what he had just lost. He needed Augustin Ferraro back at the negotiating table, and he knew that with a man like him, threats were useless, money was useless, and the law was useless. So he did the only thing left to him. He struck at the one thing that man cared about. 3 days later, the article appeared in print. It didn't contain a single lie. Not 1 word had been invented. It simply chose how the facts would be read, just as a sheet of paper folded into quarters inside a purse had once been given its own meaning in a car beneath an overhead light. It called him the Providence Mafia boss, printed in bold across the top of the page. It spoke of a woman employed in his house, and it contained 4 lines. 4 lines, not 3. The first 3 could have been obtained by anyone willing to pay a few $100s to a company in Cranston. Former military. A routine police investigation involving a death in a private residence. Medical records sealed. But the 4th line was different. The 4th line described the medical debt that still remained under her name, the amount, the dates, the hospital's name. Maeve read that newspaper in the kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning, beneath the lamp above the stove, and she read it 3 times. He sat in his usual chair and watched her read. By the 3rd time, her hands had begun to tremble. 14 months in that house, and years before that in places far worse, and not once had her hands ever trembled. She placed the newspaper on the stone counter. She said only one thing. She said anyone could have found those first 3 lines. Then she said, not the 4th. Then she said, only 2 people in this house had access to that file. The kitchen remained silent for a very long time. The refrigerator shuddered and then went still. Augustine Ferraro rose, very slowly, and stood on the other side of the stone counter looking at her. He said, "And I am one of the two." He said nothing more. He didn't defend himself. He didn't speak the other person's name. He didn't reach for her, explain, or make a single promise. He simply stood there in the yellow circle of light from the stove lamp, both hands resting on the stone, and allowed those words to remain between them. And inside that silence, the woman who had trusted him enough to sit beside him every night for 14 months suddenly realized that she had no idea what he knew about her, or how long he had known it, or why. In Newport, Cordelia Ashworth Blaine picked up the newspaper that morning and read those 4 lines, and she knew immediately that the 4th hadn't come from her. She knew her father had obtained it somewhere else. She could have lifted the telephone. She didn't. She folded the newspaper, placed it on the breakfast table, and walked out onto the terrace to look across the bay. She didn't stop it. She didn't help either. She simply stood there and watched. And that was her crime. The only one for which she would never be forgiven. The silence of someone who had just been spared by another person. The board of directors of the Harbor District Community Center met on Thursday evening, in a room where the heater rattled, and plastic chairs had been arranged in a semicircle. The meeting lasted less than an hour. No one mentioned Maeve Callahan's name more than twice. They spoke about public image, about sponsors, about the city's upcoming budget review, and every time someone came close to saying what everyone in the room was thinking, they turned instead to something else. Then they voted. 4 against 3. In the minutes, the reason was recorded as concerns regarding funding. No one wrote down the real reason, because no one needed to. Not one person in that room wanted their name placed beside the word that had been printed in bold across the top of that morning's newspaper. The Junie program was suspended. Maeve lost the only thing left in the world that still carried her daughter's name, and she lost it because of the man who had given her the right to hide for 14 months. She was standing in the hallway outside when the meeting room door opened, and the first person to emerge was Ozzie Crone. He didn't look at her. He walked straight toward the parking lot, and she followed him, stopping him between 2 rows of cars beneath the harsh overhead lights. She asked only one question. She asked why. He stood there with his keys in his hand and didn't turn to face her. A very long time passed before he spoke. He said, "Because I know the name in that newspaper article, Miss Callahan," he said. "Not Mr. Ferraro. The other name," he said. "I have worked at this harbor for 30 years, and I have seen what happens to programs connected to that name. I have seen it 3 times, and every time it begins with a newspaper article and a list." He said, "They won't come looking for you. They will come looking for the list." Then he said, "I didn't vote against you." He said, "I was trying to keep anyone from learning the children's faces." He opened the car door and got inside, and he still didn't look at her even once. And when he closed the door, Maeve remained alone in the parking lot beneath the overhead light, listening as the sound of the engine faded into the distance. On Saturday afternoon, she returned to the training room. The wooden floor was scratched, the heater rattled, and on the wall hung a small wooden sign she had mounted with her own hands on opening day. She pulled over a plastic chair, stood on it, and took the sign down. She did it very slowly, 1 screw at a time, and when the sign came free from the wall, she held it against her chest and sat down on that plastic chair in the middle of the empty room. Augustine Ferraro stood in the doorway. He had been there for some time. He didn't come inside. He said, "I can fix this." Maeve didn't look up. She said, "How, sir?" Then she said, "By calling them." There was no sarcasm in her voice. None at all. She asked it the way she might have asked the time of a train, and that was what hurt him, because if she had been sarcastic, he could have argued with her. He didn't answer. Then she said, "If you call them, the entire Harbor District will know by next week." She said, "People will know that the program was allowed to remain not because it was good, but because someone was afraid of you." She said, "Then those children will grow up, and one day one of them will ask why this place still exists, and someone will answer." Then she raised her head, looked at him, and asked, "Do you want her name standing there like that?" Augustine Ferraro stood in the doorway of that training room and couldn't speak a single word. The man who could make a grown man flee an entire city simply by lowering his voice. The man who controlled the harbor and the unions and the things that were never written down stood there with both hands hanging at his sides, and he had nothing. For the first time in his life, everything he possessed was useless. He couldn't buy this. He couldn't threaten this. He couldn't call anyone, because everything he had, if it touched that name, would stain it. Maeve sat on the plastic chair, with the wooden sign resting in her lap, and she didn't cry. She only ran her thumb slowly across the surface of the wood, in exactly the same way she traced the faded lettering on the plastic bracelet every morning at 4:40. Beyond the window, the harbor crane stood motionless against the gray sky. That man loved her. She had known it since the night he rolled up his sleeve before 240 people. And that love, simply because it belonged to him, and for no other reason, was destroying the only thing her daughter had left behind. Those two things couldn't exist together in the same city, and neither of them knew how to repair it. On Sunday night, Wendell Barrow came down to the kitchen close to 2 o'clock in the morning, and he carried no cleaning cloth and no ledger, only his ring of keys. He placed it on the stone counter, that very same counter, and the sound of metal touching stone was dry and sharp in the empty kitchen. He didn't need to open the safe. He never had. He was the man who conducted the background checks, the man who had spent 3 evenings in the records room making every phone call, the man who had read every line before even his employer had seen it. The original had remained behind the painting for 14 months. The copy was inside his mind, and that could never be locked away. Sterling Ashworth Blaine had no hold over anyone in Wendell's family, not his children, not his health. The man had a hold over Wendell himself. Many years earlier, when Augustine's father was still alive, Wendell had taken money from this family, a small amount. He had repaid it long ago, repaid every cent, repaid it early, and no one had ever known. Sterling knew, and Sterling had proof on paper. The most loyal man at Ashgrove had been purchased with the only mistake of his entire life. He stood there and said, "I served your father," he said. "I have served you." He said, "You may do anything you wish to me, and I ask for nothing." Then he said, "But I ask one thing of you." He said, "Don't let Miss Callahan know it was me." He said, "She has only just begun to trust people again." Augustine Ferraro looked at him for a very long time, the heavy silence stretching until the only sound was the wind pressing against the window pane. Then he said, "You will be out of my house before morning." Wendell said, "Yes, sir." He turned away. Then Augustine said, "Wendell." The butler stopped in the doorway. "Yes, sir," he said. "Your matter will be taken care of," he said. "I will handle it." Then he said, "Never ask me how." At 4 o'clock the following afternoon at the Harbor District Community Center, the program had been suspended, but the training room was still there, and the children still came, because no one had told them not to, and Maeve still opened the door for them. She taught nothing. She merely opened the door. She was locking her car when Priya Raghunathan came outside with her, a 13-year-old girl, the daughter of a dock worker, the quietest child in the class. And Maeve looked across the parking lot. She studied it for exactly 2 seconds. 3 cars were parked out of line. 1 engine was running with no one inside. 2 men stood exactly far enough apart that no one could pass between them. The newspaper had printed that word across the top of the page, and that word had drawn light toward the harbor. And the people behind Sterling's fund couldn't survive beneath light. They needed him to withdraw. They had come to deliver a message, and they chose her because the newspaper had pointed directly at her. Maeve took out her keys and placed them in Priya's hand. Her voice was as ordinary as though she were asking the girl to run to the store for a carton of milk. She said, "Go inside, lock the office door, and call Uncle Ozzie." She said, "Remember to tell him Miss Maeve told you to call." She said, "Go now, child." Priya went inside. The door closed. The office smelled of old paper and the rattling heater. The girl turned the lock and her hand trembled slightly, so she had to turn it twice. Then she picked up the beige desk telephone and dialed the number taped to the wall. The number Miss Maeve had made the entire class copy into their notebooks on the very first day. She said, "Yes, Miss Maeve told me to call." She listened. She said, "Yes, in the parking lot." She listened. She said, "Yes, I locked the door." She listened. Then she said, "Yes, I am sitting here." And she sat down on the floor with the receiver pressed to her ear, her back resting against the desk, while on the other end of the line was a quiet veteran who had worked at that harbor for 30 years, and he was already running toward his pickup truck, and he didn't ask a single question. That was everything Priya Raghunathan heard that afternoon. Then the girl opened the door. It was still daylight, and the late October sun lay golden across the asphalt. The parking lot was empty. None of the cars were parked out of line anymore. Maeve sat on the front steps, one hand gripping her left arm, the arm with the scar, the arm that had caught Cordelia's head above the marble floor. She looked up at the girl and smiled. It was a real smile, not one meant only to reassure her. She said, "You called Uncle Ozzy," she said. "Good girl." Priya looked at the arm and asked, "Miss Maeve, does it hurt?" Maeve looked down at her arm for a very long time. Then she said yes. Then she said, "But do you know something? This is the first time in my life I have ever hurt for something worth hurting for." Augustine Ferraro's car entered the parking lot 10 minutes later. He stepped out, walked toward her, and looked at her arm. He didn't shout. He didn't ask who had done it. He simply reached into his coat and took out his telephone. And that was the frightening part, because no one in his life had ever watched him make that gesture without someone being made to pay. Maeve stood. She didn't stop his hand. She only said, "If you make that call, the 12 children inside will grow up knowing that the program bearing my daughter's name was built with blood." Then she said, "You have already taken her name from me once. Don't take it again." He stood there for a very long time with the telephone in his hand. For a man like him, refusing to retaliate meant losing face. Losing face meant losing power, and losing power meant losing everything his father had taught him since before he could read. Then he put the telephone back into his pocket. He said, "In 40 years, no one has ever made me do this." She asked, "Do what, sir?" He said nothing at all. It was the hardest thing he had ever done in his life, and not one person in the world would ever know that he had done it. The second meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and no one on the board expected anything more than signing the same minutes they had already signed. At 6 o'clock that evening, Ozzy Crone's old pickup truck pulled up in front of the community center, and 12 children climbed out. He had gone to collect them one by one, from the housing blocks behind the docks, from the rows of rented houses near Allen's Avenue. Driving in circles for more than an hour, and he hadn't said a single thing to them except to tell them to fasten their seatbelts. He parked the truck. The children opened the doors. He didn't get out. Priya Raghunathan turned and looked back at him through the window, and he merely tipped his chin toward the entrance of the center, and the girl understood. 12 children walked into the meeting room in a single line, without one adult accompanying them. They sat down on the plastic chairs at the back of the room and waited for their turn to speak, just as people were supposed to do at meetings like that, and not one member of the board knew how to handle it. When the public comment period began, Priya stood. She held a sheet of graph paper from a school notebook, handwritten, with 2 places crossed out, and the edges wrinkled from being held too long. She didn't apologize first, didn't thank anyone, and didn't begin with any introduction at all. She read. Her voice didn't tremble once. She read that Miss Callahan didn't teach us how to fight. She read that she taught us how to speak loudly. She read that I am the quietest child in the class, and everyone knows it, and she knows it too. She read that my father works at the harbor, and I have never dared raise my hand in class. Not once, even when I knew the answer. Then she read the final sentence. She read that today I am standing here speaking to all of you, so she has already taught me. Then she folded the paper and sat down. No one in the meeting room spoke for a very long time. The heater rattled. Then the chairperson proposed another vote, 6-1. The man who had voted against the program before, the owner of the hardware store at the end of the street, raised his hand and said he wanted one sentence entered into the minutes. He said, "I didn't change my mind because of Miss Callahan." He said, "I changed my mind because a group of children just taught me a lesson about courage, and I don't want to fail that test." The children poured out into the parking lot. Priya ran ahead, straight toward the pickup truck, and slapped her hand against the window. Ozzy Crone was sitting inside with both hands resting on the steering wheel, and the engine wasn't running. His face was wet. The man who had worked at that harbor for 30 years, the man no one had ever seen blink, not even on the evening when 2 cars left the gates of Ashgrove before dark, was sitting alone in his truck in the middle of the parking lot crying. Priya said, "Uncle, we won." He didn't turn his face toward her. He said, "I know." He said, "I heard every word." Then he said, "I just wasn't brave enough to sit in there." On Saturday, Maeve hung the sign back on the wall. She tightened each screw one at a time, more carefully than she had the first time, and when she finished, she stepped back 2 paces to make sure it was straight. Then she took something from her pocket. It was a sheet of paper folded into quarters, folded for so long that the creases had begun to discolor. and she had carried it with her through house after house, through year after year. And she hadn't opened it once since that day. She opened it now, here, alone in the empty training room. On the paper was a drawing made with crayons. A woman wearing a military uniform and a cap stood straight, with 2 oversized hands and a smile that took up almost her entire face. In the lower corner was the uneven handwriting of a child still learning to write, saying, "So that one day I will remember how cool Mommy looked." Maeve stood there looking at the picture for a very long time. Then she placed it in a frame and hung it on the wall beside the sign. All her life, people had looked at her and seen either a woman who cleaned houses or something trained to do the things no one wanted to name. She had lived between those 2 ways of being seen for years, and she had believed there was no other way for a human being to be seen. She had been wrong. One child had looked at her and seen this. And now, for the first time in her life, Maeve Callahan stood in an empty room in the Providence Harbor district and saw herself through her daughter's eyes. Not a maid, not a weapon. A hero, Theodora Ferraro passed away on a night near the end of November, in her sleep, at the age of 89, in the very room where she had been born. There was no hospital. There was no sound. That morning, Marisol brought up her tea as she did every day, and the old woman looked as though she had simply gone on sleeping. And perhaps that was exactly the bargain she had been quietly making with this world for all those years. In her will, the portion left to Maeve Callahan contained only 1 line, and what she left behind was an old tin sewing box filled with needles and thread, the kind once issued to battlefield nurses, dented at one corner with a hinge that had long since loosened. Inside was a scrap of paper written in the trembling hand of an 89-year-old woman, saying, "You once stitched people back together with this. Now stitch this place and the child back together too." Maeve opened the box at 4:40 in the morning, the hour she had risen all her life. Beneath the decayed fabric lining at the bottom she found a second hospital bracelet, yellowed with age, hardened by time, from a field hospital in that year, in that place. There was no name on it, only a number, and there was a second note, written in handwriting far younger, composed long ago and kept inside that box for an entire lifetime, saying, "I couldn't save this boy. I kept this all my life so I would remember that he once had a name, even though I didn't have time to ask it. And if you are reading this, then I am already gone, and it means you are the only person in this house who understands why I kept it." Maeve sat down on the floor. The 2 bracelets lay in her palm, one pink and one yellow, separated by 70 years, and she remained there for a very long time in the darkness of the attic room. The old woman had recognized her in the very first month, not because of the way Maeve placed a tray on the table, and not because of the chair she chose. She recognized her because, for an entire lifetime, she had carried beneath her own sleeve the very same thing Maeve carried beneath hers. And the sentence Maeve had spoken in the great hall that night, the sentence that said, "I don't save anyone," had been believed by another woman in silence, inside that very house, since before Maeve had even been born. She sewed both bracelets into the lining of her wedding dress, directly over her heart. It took 3 hours. Her hands trembled. She did it alone. The wedding took place in that same great hall, beneath the same chandelier, upon the same marble floor. There weren't 240 guests. There were 31. In the front row sat Ozzy, Marisol, Wendell Barrow, and the 12 children from the Junie program, while Priya Raghunathan carried the flowers. Maeve wore a short-sleeved dress. For the first time in 8 years, her scar rested beneath the light, and she didn't hide it. She didn't need sleeves anymore, not because the scar had healed, but because she had stopped apologizing for it. That morning, an envelope arrived without a card. Inside was only a check that paid the medical debt in full, and a note saying, "I still didn't know the little girl's name, so I went and asked. Thank you for telling me," signed with a single initial. Maeve tore up the check. She kept the note. Redemption in real life has never been perfect, and perhaps it doesn't need to be. When it was time for the toast, Augustin Ferraro stood, because the person who had been meant to rise was no longer there. And for the first time in his life, he spoke before a crowd without lowering his voice. He said, "My grandmother intended to say a few words today." He said, "She told me this family has built many things, harbors, companies, reputations, and a few things I am not at liberty to mention here," and the room laughed softly. Then he said, "But she told me she had never seen anyone build what this woman has built." He said, "She didn't build it with money." He said, She walked into a room filled with powerful people and taught every one of us that dignity has never lived in a uniform. It lives beneath the uniform, and it remains there whether anyone chooses to see it or not. Then he raised his glass and said, "To Sergeant Maeve Callahan, and to Junie, the little girl who loved strawberry ice cream." Many years later, not one of the 240 people who had been present that night remembered the throw. What they carried with them for the rest of their lives was the image of a woman kneeling on a marble floor, brushing dust from a piece of plastic worth almost nothing, before people who had never been forced to lose anything. And this is what the story leaves behind. You never know who is standing in front of you. But far more importantly, you don't need to know. Maeve Callahan deserved respect even when she was only a woman who cleaned houses and had no remarkable past at all. Respect isn't a reward given to someone whose secret is impressive enough. It is the default, owed to every human being from the very first second. So ask the name of the person pouring your wine. Ask the name of the person clearing your table, delivering your package, or sweeping the hallway where you work each morning. That is all. That is the entire lesson. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so that every day you can hear more moving stories like this one. How do you feel about Maeve, about Junie, and about the man who chose to do nothing at all? Is there someone in your life whose name you wish you had asked? Leave a comment. We truly want to hear what you feel deep within your heart. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. This world is filled with people like Maeve, and right now, one of them may be wiping the table in front of you. Ask their name. You may never know who is standing before you, and you don't need to know in order to treat them like a human being. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.